Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTGO codes, check out the Poketown store. You can get yourself a nice 5% discount on your orders using the OmniPoke code, and you can even get the brand new Cosmic Eclipse stuff. For today's video, we are going to be breaking down my top 10 decks for the Latin American International Championships happening this weekend in Sao Paulo. Now, I actually fly tomorrow. And yeah, I'm really excited. I've been able to test a lot of these archetypes on PTGO, and a lot of theory has got into this as well. So hopefully I'm going to be providing some up-to-date deck lists for these top 10 and give you my reasons for why they are where they are on the list. Starting off in at number 10, as you can see, there's my ranking in the top left, as well as the community rank. So it's not just my own opinion that you can take into account here. You can also see where the more general public is. I did do a Facebook post just, I think, a week or so ago. And yeah, we get extra opinions, which is always great. So the community are pretty hyped for GreenZard. I think they all respect it within the top 10. And there's kind of two ways that you can see playing it. Either capitalizing on the brand new Charizard and Braixen tag team in a big way by having lots of hand disruption cards in there that you can sort of scout out with your Braixard, because of course Brilliant Flare lets you get 3 cards from the deck straight to your hand, so you can accumulate some pretty wacky combos. And then there's the more traditional GreenZard. My personal favorite is just a regular GreenZard. As much as I like having the crazy disruptive combos available, I think realistically a lot of the time those will be stamped away from you. And at the same time, GreenZard's damage output is just hard to say no to a lot of the time. So that's kind of the build I'll be focusing on in this top 10 list. That's the one I think has the most potential to do well. You'll see that I've done a little breakdown of how I believe the deck changes, as well as a small matchup spread of the top 10 decks that I have here. So a quick spoiler if you want to see the top 10 decks that I'm thinking of. So really, post-Cosmic Eclipse, Tag Call is great. I think GreenZard and obviously GardEon, they both really enjoy having Tag Call in the list. I previously was a bit of a hater of Green's decks. I thought they were a little bit inconsistent. Tag Call giving you access to multiple Pokemon, as well as getting you towards even like less powerful supporters, like things like Cynthia and Caitlyn and Malamar. They're still deck thinning, and at the same time, Cynthia Caitlyn at least gives you a draw 3 option. So it's a Cherish Ball that now gives you a supporter out, even if it is a poor supporter. It at least gets you a few more cards to not lose the game. So Tag Call is really awesome for that aspect. Malamar is a great healing option, which is awesome. The deck can also take advantage of Mega Lopunny and Jigglypuff, one of the strongest cards, I believe, from this set. And because you're using a Welder engine, you can take full advantage of this, which is very awesome, and can really help the deck close out games. I think previously GreenZard did kind of struggle with that aspect. If you are forced to use something like your Double Blaze for the full value, you take a big 300 damage tag team knockout, then you get stamped, and then you fizzle. Now you're just a low puff away from winning the game. That can be a combination of like tag switch or finding your welders and whatnot, and that can be pretty sweet. So I think the low puff really does help close the game, and that's a big deal for the deck. One challenge for the deck, I think, is Chaotic Swell. Obviously, this is a greens-based build, so it's very reliant on Plant and Stamp. That's the combination that we know so well from Green's decks. And Chaotic Swell means that people can have abilities like available to them, so your stamps aren't as strong. And at the same time, Chaotic Swell is really annoying with Keldeo. Keldeo is a big threat for GreenZard. Obviously, it has type coverage, and when an ADP uses its GX attack, the Keldeo can one-hit KO these Zards, which is super scary and really puts you on a clock. So I think having answers to that is the reason why I don't have it much higher on this list. I do believe Keldeo will be a big presence in Latin America, so GreenZard has to just sit at 10 right now. Here's the list, not too different from the one I posted just the other day. I ended up going towards Great Catchers rather than Customs after playing with it a little bit more. It did open up some space for a couple extra supporters, which I like. Lieutenant Surge's Strategy and Faber in here to try and help out against that Chaotic Swell. I also took out the Shrine of Punishment because I don't think Pikarom is enough of a threat to tech for it, especially when you already have a low puff as a sort of different tech, I guess you could say. So yeah, that's the kind of route we've gone for. I do have a handful of other options on the far right as well. Like I said, if you are still a fan of customs, you can go for that. Control is one of our harder matchups, so having an Omastar in here could certainly be useful. Shrine of Punishment, again, if you're still expecting Pikarom, or if you're worried about opposing low puffs, that can be useful. Lusamine to help recover power plants, so you don't run out against Keldeo-based decks if they are playing Swell. Great Potion just for additional healing, and Pheromosa to give yourself a pivot from Mallow and Lana. I think that's actually reasonably decent. I've added in a tag switch since my video as well, because that has great synergy with Mallow Lana as well. You just tag switch to a new attacker whilst healing the benched one. But Pheromosa could be an alternative just as a free retreat pivot, so that Mallow Lana is like more live throughout the entire game. So yeah, overall, this is still relatively standard as we know GreenZard to be. But with 2 additional tag team attackers to give this deck a bit more flexibility is definitely a welcome sight, and I'm a big fan of it. In at number 9, we have Malamar. Malamar is big on the community side of things. It's ranked number 5 for them, but not quite as high for me. I think my biggest concern with Malamar is Mallow and Lana. I think Mallow and Lana is a card that I'm hugely hyped on. You just saw it in the GreenZard. You're going to see it in a lot of other lists I have on this top 10. Because it's just a phenomenal card, and I really do think it will see a lot of play, and it makes a lot of sense because Malamar, even though I'm not rating it that high, it still has a fan base and will still be popular in tournaments. It always has been pretty much. So I think that's the main thing that scares me about playing Malamar. The Giratina loop strategy that we know so well is just much less powerful now that people can basically undo that turn of pressure you had just by playing their supporter for turn. Also at the same time, Arceus, Palkia, Dialga, they are very awkward. It's a very awkward matchup because they will also play the heals and they take 2 prizes on your Giratinas every turn, which is obviously very horrible. So it really puts you on the clock to have higher damage output is really the biggest issue there. I do think it still has a decent Mewtwo, and I think that's one of the things keeping Malamar within this top 10 and keeping it a relevant archetype. Which is one thing going for it. And also, Great Catcher is phenomenal in the deck. I have really enjoyed using Great Catcher in Mali. And I'm also enjoying the fact that other people are playing Great Catchers, so they don't get around Spell Tag quite as often, which is also great for you for setting up damage to take additional prizes here and there, or set up damage for us to gust and finish things off later. I think that's certainly going to be the case as long as things like the new Fione or Volcanion Prism stay out of lists. If they are going into lists to deal with Malamar and to help against like Clefairy decks and such, that could be a bit of an issue. It would make you have additional spell tags in play, or make you play a little bit stranger around those sorts of cards. So definitely something to bear in mind. I think you can see there's a bunch of unfavorables here. I really think all 4 in that unfavorable column, they're all playing Mallow Lana to some capacity, and even in the close matchups, I would say that ReshiRom and Ability Zard are probably going to have some healing elements in there. Control is worse than it used to be. I think previously Malamar was actually a little favoured against Pidgeotto as long as you knew what you were doing, as long as you were trying to limit your bench, have Mew available, have Mimikyu to use their resource management against you. It really put the ball in the Pidgeotto player's court to play very well. But I think Belbella Bryson Man means that oftentimes they can actually just push through on you at times, and they also have the sort of cheese factor of just hitting too many good targets off Belbella, and then they can just pass with their Oranguru and stop you from using Mimikyu, and that actually gets really rough. So yeah, I think your control matchup got slightly worse. I used to have it as favourable, but now I would say it's very close and more difficult for to navigate as the Malamar player for sure. So yeah, its matchup spread is really being carried on the fact that Mewtwo is still a really, really strong deck. For my list, it's not too different again from the one that I made a video of. I think it was just yesterday. As you know, I'm sure you all are making tweaks as you go in the build up to this tournament. We're learning more and more as we have more games on the ladder and as there's more content being created about decks, etc., and more articles come out and such. My latest build has dropped the Esper just to put in that Mimikyu, because I think if Mali doesn't beat Mewtwo, there's no reason to play the deck. So I've added it back in just to be like, well, I can at least beat Mewtwo. At least there's something going for me. For other options, I actually put the Mimikyu on here. That's because the card wasn't in my original 60, so this can just be an Esper, right? There's the new Blacephalon that you could be going for. I know a lot of people sort of gave me hate for not putting it in my list in the video just the other day. But that's fine. I mean, it's not a card that I'm a huge fan of, but you can definitely put it in the list. And going back to the point I made earlier about Giratina being a lot worse, as just trying to loop itself with Shadow Impact, we may be looking towards things like Tina Chomp or Ultra Necrozma once again, just to have some extra one-hit KO potential, because I really do think that's where Malamar has to turn towards in future. A few extra supporter options. I'm only playing the sort of lowest number of 8. You could try and work in Ericas or Rosas if you like. There's the new Marshadow that you could be considering, Lana's Fishing Rod, to sort of double up on some of these one-off techs in matchups where they're helpful, and also Adventure Bag's a card that I've previously liked in this sort of deck. In at number 8, we have Ability Zard. Ability Zard, you know, when it first came on the scene at Worlds, really did surprise people in how powerful it was. And I think it's kind of been off the radar. And there was a point where it was the most popular deck, and then it got heavily teched for. And the deck never really recovered from that pre-Cosmic Eclipse. But now I do think there's definitely reason to sort of look towards this archetype once again. The community have it up there at 12th. I think there's still a bit of disbelief that the archetype is still around, but I do think it certainly has some good matchups that it can boast, and I think there's a lot going for it, to be honest. I really like the variety of attackers that it naturally plays. Having Victini Prism as a great one-hit KO style card, having Turtonator as well for a similar approach, means that we're not pigeonholed into going down a tag team route, which is really good. Ninetales is obviously amazing Gust, and it's even safer now that other people are playing great catches in a lot of lists. Your Ninetales can just sit on the board and be super valuable for the entire game, which is excellent. I do think the reset stamp continues to be a problem. That's why, although you may think on paper some of these matchups are strong, I've got them only as close matchups just because the stamp factor. If you just get stamped and like miss your next welder or whatever else, life gets pretty ugly for you. And whenever you're up against decks, especially like ADP, if Stamp just works for a turn with ADP, even if you're just sitting Stellar Wishing and passing, that's 2 extra prizes that they get to take on you straight away, and you lose a lot of momentum. So Stamp is still a definite issue for Ability Zard. That's why I don't have it higher up on the list. But I do think it at least has the attackers to deal with most of these matchups here, which is pretty cool. Also, I'd say that low puff is a bit of an issue for this archetype, as is Keldeo. Keldeo not a super big issue, just because you have like I said, the Turtonator and the Victini Prism. They can definitely push through on the Keldeo, but it's more so the fact that they're single prizes that will get responded on by, you know, a following up ADP or a follow up Keldeo, and if that's the case, they're taking up those 2 prizes again. So it really does force you to have a lot of resources against them, which is something that I think is a little bit awkward. So here is my list right now. It's a little bit different from previous builds. We've made the space for the new Mega Low Puff. I really do think it's a solid card against, you know, Mewtwo, Pikarom, and a handful of other things out there, which is pretty awesome. I'm playing the 1-2 line of Ninetales, and then I'm going cheeky with the 1 Ditto Prism Star and the Zeb Striker. I think Zeb Striker plus Victini Prism really does mean that we have a pretty solid matchup against Pidgeotto Control, and thanks to 9 Temptations, you have a really good matchup against Florges as well. I think that's an also win, as long as you, well, it actually depends on their hoods and stuff, but you can definitely disrupt their early game while they're sort of struggling to find hoods, so that's definitely pretty good for you. So yeah, Sprint is a really nice thing for Pidgeotto Control. And like I said, the variety of attackers is pretty nice in tag team matchups. I am playing Mallow and Lana. If you remember back to the Worlds list that Tord had, he was playing Super Scoop-Ups to help him out heal against things like Malamar. The Scoop-Ups could actually be helpful again against Mega Low Puff and let you reuse the Dene. They were more versatile cards, but obviously they're coin flips. Mallow Lana I'm a little bit happier to use in general, but you definitely can consider Super Scoop-Up in here as well. In terms of other attackers, you could think about the Baby Blacephalon and the Fire Crystal build. You'll notice I'm only playing 16 Fire, because the Mega Low Puff I'm hoping is enough of a decent finisher that you don't need the full 18 with Victini, but you could go down that route if you want to. You could lean heavier into the Tag Call engine and have 1 or 2 copies plus 1 Sinlin if you want to. Pokegears to help you hit more welders. Volcanion as another non-GX attacker that you could try and work into the list. Reset Stamp is one of these cards that you never really want to make too many spaces for in this deck because you are so aggressive and they don't help you out when you are trying to recover from Stamp. but you can go down that route if you want to. And then Volcarona GX could be sort of subbed in for one of these other stage 1s, or even if you are just playing the Ditto, you could try and work in one Volcarona to again be a bit of a math fixer and to help you push a little bit further against more tag team matchups. And it means that even things like the Heatran and the Turtonator can work towards one-hit KOs without committing a tag team to the board, which could be pretty reasonable. So Volcarona could be a decent card, even as just a one-of in this deck if you really wanted to, alongside Ditto, or even just like make the spaces for a Larvesta as well. I've definitely seen some builds that have just gone down a Great Catcher route, had no Ninetales whatsoever, and had Volcarona, which just made the ReshiZard like much more of a attacking threat, more than ever really. So that's an alternative route as well that I haven't had enough testing with to tell you for sure how to build it, but it's something that I do want to discuss, and I wouldn't write off that sort of build either. In at number 7, we have Pikarom. Pikarom was the highest point-earning deck in the previous format, the Unified Minds meta. But the community and myself have both had to drop it down a peg or two because there's a lot of things that makes Pikarom's traditional game plan a lot worse. Chaotic Swell is very scary because it will naturally just cover you from putting down an early Thunder Mountain and getting full blitzing, so that already eats into your turn 2 full blitz odds, which is very rough. Also, Low Puff is just such an easy way for opponents to burst out a nice one-hit KO to just end the game for Pikarom, which is very scary for sure, because Pikarom is one of these archetypes that pretty much has to be hard carried by its tag teams, and there's not much else it does. Maybe here and there you have 1 or 2 non-GXs, but for the most part it's all in on the tag teams, right? You're full blitzing to your next Choo Choo or to your next Pikarom, so the Low Puff really will be punishing that. I really do think as well you've got to commit spaces to your list towards beating that GardEon matchup and being aware of Keldeo as well. Malolana, I think, is a good card for this deck, but it's also one of these scary cards to deal with because a lot of the time Pikarom can try and steal wins by going for Stamp plus Paralysis plays with Choo Choo. Now they have a much more searchable means of switching out of their attacker, at the same time getting a bit of heal, which can really put you back a turn. And at the same time, Pikarom was kind of known as a really good tempo deck. I think a lot of the times you would win with Pikarom was just because you got early full blitz on the board before your opponent got an attack in, and that 150 damage will help carry over and help you close a game. Because you can just have one hit KO attacker, usually with a Choo Choo, or with like a Pikarom with a bunch of E-powers stacked up together. And the thing that you can just nice and easily two-shot through thanks to your early full blitz is a great way to close games. Now Malolana sort of denies that, and it means that, you know, you're a turn behind on tempo. So Pikarom being such a tempo-orientated deck, I do think struggles just because people can undo that damage so much more easily now with Malo and Lana. You'll notice the matchup spread doesn't look too pleasant for Pikarom. Again, I still think there's a lot of reasonable matchups, but I think things like Ability Zard, GreenZard, they can all be playing Low Puff now, and they can just close the game on you so much easier than they used to be able to, which I think is a little bit awkward. Blacephalon Birds, I think, is, you know, kind of mediocre. Mewtwo, I still think, is close. Some people would say unfavored. I always sort of sit on the camp of it being like a close matchup, pretty decent, but never that great. I think the good news of Pikarom is the Latios attacks are a lot worse now than they used to be against Pikarom, because A, you can Malolana and heal, and B, you can Great Catcher them as well. So it's way better against Mewtwo in that regard, but the one-hit KOs are still obviously an issue that you have to try and contend with. And I also think against some of these other tag team decks, you're not quite strong enough. I think you do struggle against the ReshiRom one-hit KO potential. I think GardEon as well, especially if they're playing the Fairy Charms, will be rough. And ADP, naturally, I think is pretty awkward. Obviously, you have more push potential than they do because you have Electro Powers and you have Choo Choo, which can do good damage, but getting through Keldeo will still be awkward, and it's probably going to require combo pieces all to be found at once, which isn't always easy. I also think, naturally, Pikarom's not phenomenal against control. I think it obviously has energy acceleration, and it has things like Zero Aura for movement, and we are playing a Marshadow now, so we can try and force the opponent to deal with the Marshadow before going for like Plant Stamp and trapping. So there is a bit more intricacies than previously with Pikarom, whereas it would just try and go all out and rush them. I feel like it's a little bit different now, so I think its control matchup actually got better from this latest set. Well, like, its own 60 is more prepared for control, but control got so much better that you probably lose anyways. So, yeah, I think the control matchup is one you wouldn't really expect to win too much. The main adaptation from my list is that I've cut into the Dedenne count just a little bit to have a higher Cynthia count. I want to have a more stable draw support account so that we aren't just, complete fodder for low puff. I still think you will fall into it at certain points in games, and that's inevitable. But having a more conventionally high support account is going to be one thing that we can try and do to mean that we don't sort of jump into the low puff at turn 1 of the game, basically, which could sometimes be the case with previous builds of PikaRom. You'll notice as well, I've cut away from the other non-GX attackers. I don't play Zapdos, I don't play Hooper. The only non-GX I play is Electros. Electros can tank a hit from a Keldeo, which is really important. And with Electro Powers, you can knock out a Keldeo in one hit, which is pretty decent. I'm also playing a Marshadow. As I mentioned, we're playing our own Power Plant now, so we can get through Keldeos once again. Not just the Electros, but also Power Plant can get us there. So having your own resetting hull to undo Power Plant is big. Not only your own copy, but also against Greens-based decks and against Pidgeotto control as well. So Marshadow, I think, is a reasonable card, and it even chips in sometimes against like Blacephalon GX and such, just because you can full blitz for 150 and then go into the red knuckles so that you're forcing Gust and stuff all on the same turn. However, it is a lot easier for Blacephalon to find Gust now that it's just one copy, rather than trying to accumulate customs, so do bear that in mind. I think your Blounce matchup actually got a little bit worse as this deck. Outside of that, not a huge amount of changes. As I said, the Power Plant's one of the biggest ones, just to help out against Keldeo and to be more disruptive against Mewtwo again, which is pretty reasonable. Malolana comes in because I'm just enamored by the card. I think it's awesome. Whenever you're playing a Jirachi engine, you can really take good advantage of this card, and I do think it's a big deal, especially against things like ADP. Like, Malolana is really strong against ADP and Malamar, so, like, what more do you want in a card, really? It's super good, and it's even good in, like, mirror matches for PikaRom specifically, so, yeah, this is a really, really good card that I think we'll see a lot of play and is super strong for the weekend. In terms of other options you could add in, I've cut away from Bill's analysis because you don't play customs anymore, but you could end up still putting in like 1 or 2 copies just to help close games, because at the same time he still does help accumulate Electro Power turns, he still gets you towards Stamp, he still gets you towards Great Catcher and such, so that's reasonable. Low Puff could be introduced to this deck as well, especially if you want to go towards a second tag switch. It could be a very dangerous threat in the game. If you want to move further away from the Dedenne build, you could go towards things like Acrobike and Order Pads. Super Scoop Up's another thing. As I mentioned with Ability Zard, they originally played Scoop Ups. Perhaps PikaRom goes down a similar route, maybe cutting the Malolanas for Super Scoop Ups as your means of heal. Again, if you add in that second tag switch, it feels like a much better card, the Super Scoop Up, that is. And at the same time, that can help out against Low Puff as well. And customs are still reasonable, I think, especially because they can deal with Mews, and dealing with Mew then means that you can do big tag bolts for multiple prizes against non-GX matchups. So overall, I do think PikaRom is no longer going to be one of the top dogs of the meta, unless it does change drastically. But right now, I think it's still reasonable. It can still out-consistency a good amount of decks, and with this sort of 60 that we're going with right here, we should have answers to a good majority of the meta, so there's at least that going for it. In at number 6, we have one that I believe is being underrated by the community, Baby Blacephalon. I actually think its matchup spread is very strong. I mean, just based on my favorables, you know, you're looking to see those tag teams, that's for sure. Any Greens deck you're happy to face, ReshiRom if that gets popular, Ability Zard, Control, which is a huge scalp to take, and ADP. I believe all of these are in the green for Baby Blacephalon birds. I really do think the spread is amazing. As long as you ignore the Malamar and the Mewtwo, I think, or at least you got to dodge them, right? As long as you dodge enough of them in day 1, you'll easily get into day 2 with Baby Blacephalon. I really think it's solid. Potentially not good enough to like win the tournament, but easily good enough to make day 2 of the tournament, I think. It seems very well placed, and it has a very simple rinse and repeat strategy, which is appealing for a lot of people because it just does what it does, and it should be good enough to win a bunch of games, which is cool. I really like, just naturally in a vacuum, that this gets to play Great Catcher now. It opens up a couple deck spaces, which, you know, I know a lot of decks are gaining those spaces, but they got to commit those spaces to like Keldeo techs or all this other stuff these days. Baby Blacephalon doesn't have to do that. It literally gains 2 spaces in the deck, which gave me an extra switch card and an extra, an initial pal pad. Previously, there was no pal pad for this list, so having pal pad for additional welders is such a dream come true. I was really happy with the 2 slots that we gained, and at the same time, you're way safer against reset stamps. So I think, as I said, dodge and weave the SPDOs in the room, basically, and this deck could be very, very strong. For the list, like I said, it's really close to the initial 60 that we saw from the regionals. But as I mentioned, we've gone to great catchers. I've added in a pal pad, and we've got a second escape board in there. So very simple changes. Blacephalon is pretty cut and dry at this point. If you do want to add in a few other things, Blacephalon GX could add in a nice GX attack option to close games. So essentially, you knock out one tag team with Fireball Circus. Then you go for like a gust effect on a Dedenne and Fireball Circus, and then Blacephalon can get you over the line, which is pretty nice. Beast Ring, obviously, even if you're just playing like 1 or 2 copies, gives you a bit of a release from finding Welder every turn. However, oftentimes we use Flint so aggressively that there's not always enough energies in the deck, so do bear that in mind. Rosa, I think, combines well if you do play Beast Ring in your list, and that can help you get your next Blacephalon down, which can sometimes be a big deal. You can also get your Victini Prism for the right turn, so that could be nice as potentially a one-of. Lucidbeam Prism Star is a strong card against not many matchups, but when it is strong, it's absolutely back-breaking for the opponents, because for the majority of the time, they won't be playing custom catchers, so they just have to pass into you, basically, and that's just obviously insane. If you want to have a better time against Dolstall, I don't have any answers to Dolstall, but if you want to play Ditto Ninetales, you can do that, and then your Dolstall matchup gets a lot better. I think obviously they do play Stealthy Hoods, but again, you're going to try and be aggressive on their Flabebes and stuff in those initial phases and force them to go for Steamer's Resolves and grab those hoods as quickly as possible. You're basically going to try and rush them down with Ninetales. And also Beast Energy Prism, just to A, increase your energy count in general, and B, just help you get over the line with Fireball Circus that little bit more. It basically requires you to have 1 less physical energy in your hand, so definitely a reasonable one-of if you want to try that. In at my number 5 slot, we have ReshiRom. Now, the community has done a complete flip-flop on ReshiRom. I remember when I was doing my set review, people were pretty sure that this was one of the best cards in the set as a great new attacker. And then people tried it out, and people hated it. I was in the same camp, guys. I really did dislike my initial build of ReshiRom. I was gobsmacked at how poor it performed in my first initial games. But I've gone back to the drawing board and rebuilt ReshiRom in a way that I think is much more competitive now. So much so that I'm willing to take a lot of flack if it does end up being very bad in this meta. I don't necessarily think it'll do well in LATAM because I don't think enough people have got the confidence in the archetype right now, but I think ReshiRom will find its place in this meta, and I think if people are brave enough to take it to Latin America, they may be able to reap the rewards. Especially because for some of its favorables, like having a good Pikarom and Mewtwo and a GreenZard, those are 3 decks that were set in stone, great decks pre-Cosmic Eclipse. A lot of people, especially for new tournaments, new metas, they like to stick to their guns, stick to what they know, and hope to just out-consistency people and beat newer lists. Whereas ReshiRom is coming in and saying, good for you, you've stuck to a deck that you know, but this one beats you, basically. So I really do think ReshiRom is great at dealing with tag teams. I think it's got solid matchup spread. Blacephalon Birds, I don't think will be like hugely represented, even though it's a great deck. So I think that's a great unfavorable to take. And in general, yeah, you're just a very good damage output archetype. And I do think we were right to believe this was one of the best cards in the set when it came out, and building it in a different way has sort of opened my eyes and restored confidence in this build. So I'm going against the grain in terms of the community and how they foresee this archetype. I'm really hoping that I can be correct with this judgment, because in my top 10 there's no Blacephalon GX, and a lot of people want Blacephalon in their top 10 for sure. So ReshiRom has basically taken the space of Blacephalon GX in my top 10 slot. Like, Blacephalon wouldn't be in at number 5. It would kind of be like around the 8 sort of category, I think, in my mind. If I took this off the list and I would just push stuff further down, I guess. But I think Yeah, this is a risky one from me, and I don't expect it to have a huge showing at LATAM, but maybe there'll be one or two people who go deep in the tournament with it, and then we'll be like, oh, that's how you play ReshiRom. It's going to be insane now. So yeah, this is going to be my attempt of ReshiRom. I'm also going to do a video of this. I think it'll come out tomorrow. I'm pre-recording a bunch of stuff before I fly. And yeah, this is my like new age build. It's using Tag Call Engine and Red and Blue to get that initial Dragon Naga into play. That gives you 180 damage to work with, and it gives you a draw engine, which is fantastic. You then just need like 1 or 2 charging ups on the board for the rest of the game, and all your other Naga pieces are fodder for your draw power to help you get a chain of Fabled Flare Bolts, which is awesome. And I think some of the key cards, the Shrine of Punishment and the Stadium Nav, and the Beast Energy, all 3 of these cards are pretty important. Obviously, having Stadium Nav for Shrine is blatantly obvious against ADP, right? We hit 270, now we knock them out, which is awesome. You don't care about Shrine damage coming back into you. You have far too much hit points that they're two-shotting you anyway, no matter what. So Shrine never affects you negatively. Maybe it affects you negatively against your own Dedenes, but that's about it. And obviously, we're playing 3 other stadiums anyway, so sometimes you can just bounce your own Shrine, or they will bounce it for you. So that 1 Shrine tick is huge against knocking out Arceus Palkia Dialga, and at the same time, it puts Turning Point in range for knocking out Keldios, which is sweet, because that's normally the thing they'll power up. In this sort of matchup, they'll see a ReshiRom, and they'll just only put down 1 ADP and put down Keldios against you. Well, now, as long as you knock out ADP first, you can then knock out Keldeo with your Nagas, which is really sweet, and then you can just close the game with the Dedenne, or you can even close the game on things like ADP. So, yeah, really awesome. The Beast Energy also works if they haven't put down or like if we haven't found Shrine and stuff. So, Naga definitely has great ways of knocking out Keldeo, which is a huge deal. Also, the Beast Energy comes in so that we can have Venom Shot as a possibility in the deck, which is pretty cool. I'm playing Stinger just because I'm expecting Control to be strong, and I think it puts them on a clock, especially because turn 2 you can Red and Blue Stinger, and then it's similar to being like an ADP deck, really. You go for the Stinger straight away, and then you're 3 attacks away from winning the game. ADP goes for their Jex attack, and then they're 3 attacks away from winning, so it's really, really similar in how you're going to try and beat that matchup against Control. Just put them on a clock as quickly as possible, try and stamp them when you can, etc. So yeah, I really like the Volkner engine. As you can see, I'm rating this higher than Pikarom now. I think it naturally has just better answers to stuff, and it gets to also abuse the Volkner engine to help get you stamps, to help get you great catches, and that's really sweet overall. So yeah, I'm hyped on this archetype once again, and I'm hoping that my confidence sort of pays off with this build. I hope people take a risk with the archetype if they have given it enough time. For other options, I am still experimenting with this list. Blacephalon and potentially like 1 or 2 Beast Rings, even if you don't play Blacephalon, could be reasonable, just because you have all those Nagas as outs, which is awesome. Heatran GX, Turtonator, these are all attackers that you could try and use just because you're abusing charging up, of course. Mysterious Treasure for more search towards your Nagas and giving you some discard synergy. Welder, obviously the initial list that we all tried out that sort of flopped were like heavy welder reliant, but playing like 1 or 2 welders just to give you additional outs to work towards your ReshiRom in 1 turn could be nice. At the moment, our main outs to like putting down a ReshiRom out of nowhere and attacking is like pop a Coco Prism at the same time, or do energy switch shenanigans and manual attachments. That can all be found from a Volkner, which is cool. But yeah, it can be sometimes a little weak against Stamp if you haven't already like preset down your second ReshiRom, which sometimes, you know, you won't do against like low puff and stuff like that, but a lot of the time it's fine. End's Resolve could be weaved into the deck. You could see that you can improve a couple matchups. You can have a better time against like Baby Blacephalon Birds. You could have a better matchup against Malamar if you do play End's Resolve, because you can go for that Crossbreak GX and take a couple prizes all at once, which is sweet. Tag Switch could also go into the deck just to open up the doors for things like low puff to come into the list. Or again, just to set up other attackers in general. So yeah, I think this is still experimental, but I think this is a much, much better direction than the welder-based variant that we all started off with ReshiRom. And I'm glad that I had I had the idea to try it again, I guess, and sort of gritted my teeth through it, being like, 270 is such good raw stats that it can't be bad. And I'm hoping that I've got the ball rolling once again for us to be talking about this archetype, and hopefully in the gameplay I have of this deck tomorrow, you guys will see some of that in action as well. In at number 4, I have GardEon. The community are also pretty similar in where they believe this deck should be. Tag Call, as I said, with the GreenZard deck is great, and GardEon loves it to be able to get their next Pokemon on board so you can start Fairy Songing onto them. And at the same time, you have great access to Malamar, and Cynthia Caitlin getting back more greens and stuff is phenomenal. I think the Tag Call engine is even better in this list than it is for the GreenZard, actually, because GreenZard so often needs to weld it anyway, whereas GardEon has much more license to use things like Cynthia Caitlin, whereas it used to use, what's it called, Coach Trainer. Cynthia Caitlin is usually a better option because it can get you 3 cards plus a greens, which is better than 4 random cards basically all the time. So yeah, that's pretty awesome. GardEon also finds itself in a decent meta spot. 2 of the newcomer decks in the set are both dragons, ADP and possibly the less popular ReshiRom. They're both dragon types, so if you want to tech charms, you can do, and naturally you have weakness, so good 1-hit KO potential against them. Low Puff also, similar to ReshiZard really. You can just tag switch onto him, attach to it, and it could be swinging out of nowhere, which is great. Chaotic Swell is kind of the big issue for greens-based decks right now. Swell Keldeo is an awkward combo. Again, I'm trying to play Faber in here to try and have a better chance against these decks, to sort of shut them down as well, to try and go for a Faber stamp play. That can certainly be an option that we have available to us, as long as we're able to set it up in our hand. The matchup spread's really weird for GardEon. It doesn't like facing Charizard stuff. It hits too hard, and Blacephalon also hits like a truck against us. However, you do like seeing a bunch of the other stuff. I really think its matchup spread is really, really strong, and you can see there, a big one from me, Control is in the green. Yep, I'm teching the Omastar. The Omastar that I didn't tech in GreenZard, I'm teching in GardEon. I'm also playing Customs and Oranguru. You'll notice that I'm not playing Xerneas GX in my current GardEon. Xerneas GX I found to be a bit of a liability, just because ADP can knock out Xerneas GX for 3 prizes, and that's really ugly. So if you start Xerneas, it can just be a lost condition against things like ADP, which is really bad for you, of course. And I think now with Great Catcher and Customs, we're naturally a lot safer against the Latios attacking in a Mewtwo matchup, whereas previously you had things like Xerneas, so if they were just going for tag purge attacks over and over again as Mewtwo, you could get through them with a Xerneas GX to heal off all the damage from yourself, because you could just bench the Xerneas, switch into it, tag switch onto it, and suddenly it's healed all your GardEons for that 240, and you've just knocked out the Latios, which is pretty sweet. Nowadays, I think we have enough Gust that it's not a problem. As I mentioned, Pheromosa could be reasonable in GreenZard. I actually have made the plunge and put it into GardEon because it's a great pivot for your Malolana that you will be spamming a lot of the time and recovering with Cynthia Caitlin when you can, if you don't need greens, for example. I'm also playing Oranguru. This is respecting Dolstall as a thing. If you just have Customs and Resource Management, you can't lose to Dolstall. Even then, we play Omastar, so there's no way we can lose to Dolstall with this deck. Having the Omastar, Rare Candy, and Unidentified Fossil means that we have a decent time against birds as well. They can't trap us as easily with what are they called? With Customs. They can't hammer us away. They have their Articuno attack once, and we should be able to have enough energies in the deck to sort of defeat that. So yeah, I'm hoping that this over-teched deck can deal with Control, but I do think it's the only Achilles heel of GardEon, apart from Fire decks, so as long as your opponent isn't flipping over red cards, you're normally happy with this build, which is pretty sweet. There's not much else going on with the list. You'll notice that I've committed spaces to Control rather than playing Fairy Charms. I think going into an unknown meta is really bad for you to play Charms because, you know, what counts do you play? Who knows, really? So I'm playing Choice Helmets. Choice Helmets are, like, generally good, but also good for Mirror, which is something worth noting. So yeah, I think Choice Helmet is my preferred choice just because I don't know how popular Mewtwo will be. I don't know how popular Pikarom will be. Don't know how popular ADP will be. So I'm just sort of saying, well, hopefully Choice Helmet is enough. And things like Malamar can slow the opponent down a little bit, and things like Mega Lopuff can come in close games a little bit faster than GardEon used to be able to. That's the sort of trade-off that I'm going for here. You'll see I've got Faber, once again, to deal with Swell. And yeah, not much else is too different from previous lists of GardEon. I'm not playing any Cherish Balls, of course. We just have Tag Calls, and then I've got the one Pokecom to help us get things like Omastar, Pheromosa, and Oranguru into play. For options, if you do want to just take a bold call and sort of like have a much better time against certain matchups, Fairy Charms are still a decent option. But it's just picking and choosing which ones feel best. I wouldn't commit more than 4 spaces to Fairy Charms, personally. But if you want to cut the Omastar and just take Control as an L, you could maybe make those spaces, which for me sounds ugly, but you can if you want to. You can put the Xerneas GX back in the list, of course. He's still reasonable. Xerneas Prism as well, now that we're playing non-GXs, could be cool. Kotick Swell yourself. I would only play Swell if you were also playing Fairy Charms. But it just gives you a better time and makes those Fairy Charms work a lot better. Lusamine could be coming into the list just to give yourself extra access to Power Plants, and it makes you way more infinite. You can get back Cynthia Kaelin, that can then get back the Lusamine, so just one copy is cool. Guzma and Hala could be decent. Again, if you're leaning more towards Charms, I would definitely assume Guzma and Hala could be a better card in this list. And for a little bit of extra healing, even if it is just 1 or 2 copies, Great Potion could be reasonable, so that you can greens for them rather than have to have the Malamar already in hand for healing. So yeah, that's my build of GardEon. It's a lot different than it used to be, but I really do think the Pheromosa free retreating is extremely valuable for making Malamar good, because that's like one of the main sort of crutches of GardEon, I think, at the moment. And answering control feels so good. You start seeing Pidgeotto control emoting against you on PCGO these days. They really do think they auto-win. And when you put down these cards, you can start emoting them. Poggers. In at number 3, we have Perfection. The community are also pretty hyped on this archetype. Mewtwo was, again, one of the top decks. It obviously won the World Championships in the Unified Minds meta, and coming into this one, it does have a few things that it needs to sort of balance out. It really does feel like this deck has to really walk a tightrope of the matchups that it wants to beat. I think answering GardEon and Keldeo, as well as Mimikyu, are all sort of mandatory needs, which is a little bit awkward. I also think that Lopuff is naturally a bit of a threat to this archetype in general, just because of the amount of Mewtwo that you put down and the Denes and such, which I think can be awkward. At the same time, man, it feels bad when you go second against ADP and they just drop a Swell for the sake of it, because you really need to get your Giant Hearths down so you can be Weldering, because we naturally only play like 8 fires, so oftentimes the main means of us getting a Welder off is via Hearth. So Swell is a big pain against Mewtwo. That's the biggest thing that's put me off this archetype and made me put it at number 3 instead of any higher on the list. It's literally exactly Chaotic Swell that made me put it right where it is right now. The best thing about Mewtwo, however, is that, you know, it can still use the best attacks in the game, and Gusting got a lot better as well. We used to have to play like 1 copy of Bill in Mewtwo just to try and find customs, and it sucked, and Tord even did a list that had no customs in there just because he hated them so much that he would rather play Shedinja instead of Gust in his list. So that should tell you how relieved Mewtwo is to be able to use great catches now. That really is a welcome addition to the deck. You'll notice I've got a lot of close matchups around here. It naturally always has a decent time against Pidgeotto. You can definitely steal games against them just by going for early knockouts with SBDO. I think GardEon, not fantastic, but at the same time we are playing answers to it. Ability Zard, GreenZard, Pikarom, all this sort of stuff. I think you can do decently well against, but the final 3 that I just mentioned, they have 1 hit KO potential, and they could easily be playing Lopuff that can just blow you out of the water as well at times, which is really awkward. I think for unfavorables, ReshiRom is naturally going to be having great 1 hit KO potential, and Malamar is going to be playing Mimikyu, which makes you find hoods, makes you heal a bunch, and even then it's going to be awkward. You also need to find your weakness guard energies ASAP. So here is the list that I'm rocking with Mewtwo. The biggest change I tried to make to move away from the sort of Lopuff factor is adding in the Jirachi engine. We saw a few Jirachi builds of Mewtwo do reasonably well in some Unified Minds tournaments. And I think it might have to be the way that we go moving forward. Give me any excuse to play Jirachi these days just because of how good Malamar is. You naturally heal, and you also get to have an extra Stellar Wish, which is great for you in general. We're playing the Greninja and the Water Energy and the 1 Viridian so that we can hit through Keldios. Yes, they have Malamar. We have Malamar ourselves, so it's going to be a bit of a back and forth for a few turns, and hopefully you can get over the line against them. Especially because you can be doing the Mist Slashes whilst also weldering to your guy, or maybe one of your benched guys, so that you can set up a Double Blaze as well to get through a Keldeo all in one hit. I think I tried Low Puff, and ultimately it was a space that I had to cut, so I could fit things like Stealthy Hood, because you've got to have answers to mimic you. But I could certainly see you wanting to add in a Low Puff just for good one-hit KO potential. It's also obviously an attacker that gets around Power Plant, which is reasonable. Zard could be another attacker, but I think it's too much of a luxury right now. We've seen things like Treasure and Mind Report come into the list previously. I've sort of covered that by having a Cynthia Caitlyn now, so that can be a means of recovering welders if you've had to Dede change a bunch away. Guzma and Hala is definitely a card you could be considering as well to help you grab Weak Guard energy as quickly as possible. And at the same time, it can get your early stadiums, which is a big deal. And of course, we only play one copy of Stealthy Hood, so if we are faced with a very early Mimikyu, it's going to be rough for us to try and find it without the Guzma Hala. So you can certainly sort of put that in your list. Oricorio, GX, if you're really just throwing caution to the wind against a Low Puff and saying that, hey, we're probably going to fall prey to it at some point anyways, let's just put an Oricorio down. And if you're combining it with like Resetting Hole on your board, you can be pretty good at being stamp proof, and you can probably close games quite nicely. I've also tried out Pokegear Acrobike Engine instead of Jirachi, again trying to force us to trying to make us not have to put down as many Dedenes. I do still think that is quite reliant on Dedenne very often. And also I've tried Celtic Swell of my own end and had Fiery Flint in the list instead of Giant Hearth. That was in response to me being really frustrated at playing a bunch of ADP on the ladder and basically never being able to use Giant Hearth. I was like, well, I'm just going to use Fiery Flint instead to get my fires out, and I'll just play my own swells to help me out against power plants. So yeah, that's definitely an option you could go for as well, if you think it's the better option. I realised I was meant to put Stealthy Hood here. It's a card that's already in my list, and I've spelt it wrong, so you can tell that I've put in a lot of work for this list. I've been changing a lot with Mewtwo recently. I've been adding in one-off attackers. I've had like 2 Solgaleos in here at times. I've had Guzma Hala in here at times. I really am scratching my head at how to build Mewtwo properly right now. But this is where I'm at the moment, and I did end up putting the Stealthy Hood in just because it's dumb to lose to just one card in a list. But potentially a Guzma Hala might have to squeeze into this 60 as well, just so you can have access to it a little bit earlier. But yeah, that's where we're at with Mewtwo. I think Jirachi build going forward might be the way to go, just to help out against Low Puff. It depends how popular that card ends up being in the format. In at number 2, in line with the community here, we have ADP. ADP is a pretty vanilla archetype in that you're going to try and do rinse and repeat. You're going to try and use Arceus Palkia Dialga's GX attack as quickly as possible, and from there, when you take prizes, you take extra. When you take knockouts, you take extra prizes, and that's just busted enough that it will win games on its own. At the same time, Keldeo Swell, you notice that all my greens decks are having to play stupid Faber in their list just to have answers to this, because otherwise Keldeo Swell just wins the game. So it's really awkward to play around in general, which is pretty sweet. I don't like the fact that this deck has to play End Resolve. It's an awkward card, and as much as it is good for the tempo of this sort of attacker in general, there are times where you just miss energies and feel very bad, and even if you hit energies, sometimes the discards are still very painful. So that's sometimes one of the biggest challenges for this deck, but overall it's something that you sort of have to put up with a brave face. And I think at the same time, you'll have noticed how much Malamar I'm playing in decks right now. It's amazing in ADP, but it's also a big problem for ADP. The damage output of this deck is relatively low. 150. After your GX attack, it's 180, which is okay, but when they're Malamar healing, it's only 50, and then another 180 won't knock out tag teams. Keldeo is at 140 after the GX attack, and again, you're not, two-shotting tag teams a lot of the time either. So I think Malolana is a bit of a pain for this archetype, and I do think if enough people play Malolana in high counts, ADP will not do very well at LAIC. But I don't know how many people are going to be playing Malolana in as high counts as I do. So yeah, that's something that is going to be interesting to follow over the course of the weekend, because honestly, I'm head over heels for Malolana. I think the card is absolutely nutty. And yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how ADP performs even with that amount of healing in the format as pretty much a 2-hit KO based deck. Let's see my list though. It's pretty vanilla still. Not too much has changed. I have added in one non-GX Dramper from the latest set. It does 70 and 70 more if you have 2 different types of energy attached to you. So your base output is 140. That means that you can knock out opposing Keldeos and Dedenes in 1 hit after you've used an Altered Creation GX attack, which is really sweet. So it's a great non-GX attacker. In order to accommodate that, I have gone down the Pokecom route, and I've actually cut away from Tag Call altogether, so that we have Com for extra Dedenne outs at the same time as having extra outs towards Jirachi and Dramper, which is pretty cool. It does mean that I've cut the Cynthia Caitlyn from the list, and I've just gone down a heavier, straightforward Cynthia route, which is fine. And from there, I've added in a couple stamps from my initial list, just because Stamp is a very, very good card, basically. For other options, if you want to have a better time against control, I think naturally you put birds on a clock, but I don't think it's something that they can't deal with by any means. So adding in a Zeb Striker or even Sylvalai, just because we play Swell, you can get away with Sylvalai a good amount of times, that you will be able to close games against them, which is cool. Volcanion Prism can help out against Dolstall, and at the same time, just in general, against, again, things like birds or anything that's using a Jirachi engine, it'll bring stuff up for us to attack, and that's really awesome. Potentially, you can get away with playing 2 Great Catcher and 1 Volc Prism if you do think it's a reasonable enough card. Also, in terms of an attacking presence, you can power him up with ADP, and then you can do that spreading attack, which can set up numbers later on Dedenes for things like Keldeo to finish off, which is pretty cool. So Volc Prism may not be the worst card in the world in this list at all. If you do want to go heavier down the Tag Call route like my initial list, you can play Tag Call and Sinlin if you really want to. Lucario Melmetal can definitely help out the GardEon matchup, and its GX attack isn't too shabby either in very weird spots, some certain matchups where that's great. And Lopuff is an additional option in this deck. It sometimes can be a great card in Mirror, and it helps out that sort of 2-hit KO factor that I've just been mentioning right now, where your damage cap is kind of known by the opponents, so they can do some cool Malolana plays to shift around and stuff, and that gets a little rough. So possibly a Lopuff coming into this list could be welcomed, just to speed up your win condition and actually get damage on the board, which is pretty good. In at number 1, we have control decks. Now, I mainly mean birds here, but I'm also going to shout out the Clefairy based deck. I was always a Florgus believer as soon as I saw Lily's Clefairy or Lily's Pokedoll. So yeah, these archetypes do seem very scary and are definitely big, big threats going into this tournament. The supporters that Bird Control gains is really, really scary. Bellbella Bryson Man obviously speeding up the win condition of this deck, and at the same time making Arangaru's resource management decision-making much easier. Because previously you were committing so often towards Jesse James Stamp Surge combos. Now you can just be doing Bellbella Bryson Man, and your physical cards that you're recovering with resource management can be dedicated to so many other things that it can make you much safer in a lot of ways. You can make sure you get back your customs, you can get back your spare hammers, you can get back all this stuff for when your opponent ever breaks a lock, if a chip doesn't work or whatever. You can reestablish that lock again a lot quicker. So I really like how it fixes your resource managementing as well at the same time as being faster for you to win the game, which is great. Will is also a very, very good supporter for this deck, it turns out. Guaranteed energy removal is insane. It's a Plumeria that minuses 1 less card than Plumeria used to. Of course, you have to pay a physical Crushing Hammer to use it, but when you're looping Crushing Hammers the whole game, that's fine. And also there's the option to play Rosa in this deck. It gets you access to Cold Crush, which could also be pretty cool. And obviously, all these cards are gearable, so they're pretty accessible when you need them to be. You could also try and think about adding in your own Pokedolls into Arangaru birds, just because if it gives you a free turn here and there, that gives you like an extra 15 or so cards if you do a bunch of airmails and then go for like Marses, or if you go for Hapus and stuff, it just gives you a lot of digging potential and buys you an extra turn to assemble your combo to actually win the game. It very much reminds me of when Sander played Mareep Sleep in his bird control deck for a very similar reason. You would just try and cheese away into a free turn. If you do that, it nets you a bunch of extra cards and really just sets you up for the game, which could be very cool in this deck. And I think it's most important against ADP, to be honest, because they put you on such a short clock that buying a turn or two here and there with a doll could be absolutely integral for that matchup. At the same time, Clefairy Doll is the essence of the Florges-based build as well, so it's just the complete win condition for that list. And honestly, I think Control has to be teched against. You'll notice that the matchup spread I've done here isn't that great. GardEon I've teched for. Blacephalon Birds is in the top 10 because it has a good matchup against this deck. Ability Zard is playing Zeb Striker. My ReshiRom is playing Stinger. And yeah, I've tried to naturally add in as many techs as I can to the top 10 list. So the matchup spread doesn't look insane for this deck. But that's because I'm so damn scared of Control that I'm making the spaces for the archetype. I really do think, even if it's not going to be the most popular deck in the room, you can't ignore it. I think it's far too strong to just be like, well, we're taking the fat L to this and hoping it doesn't turn up. I think it could be somewhere around like the 8 to 10% mark of the day one field, because it is so naturally strong that even players who didn't used to like playing Control decks will just be like, yeah, Bella Bryson Man speeds up the process, so why not just go for it this time around? I'm not going to be going to time it every single round. I might be able to win and force the opponent to scoop out of it and stuff. And even if you lose a game one now as Birds, you can legitimately bring back a tie at the very least. Whereas previously, if you would lose as Birds, it's really, really hard for you to tie because the opponent can make the clock go too long. But Bella Bryson Man basically just says, no, you're out of deck cards, let's go to game 3. So yeah, if you play Super Turbo with Birds, if you get donked like game 1, you can actually maybe win a best of 3, which would be absolutely crazy to see, especially if people play the Surge double Bella. Then they can certainly win a best of 3 in enough time, which is pretty sweet. So here's the first list. I am also going to be showing you a Florges doll list as well after this one. So I've also recorded a list for this deck. I think it was 1 or 2 cards different. I think I didn't play a Faber in the video, and during the video I was like, yeah, this needs a Faber. So we added in a Faber to the 60. As you'll notice, I'm also playing the Will, of course. I really do think I'm sold on that card. It's very, very strong. And yeah, that's basically where we're at with Birds. There are obviously a few things you could think about adding in. Rosa I've already mentioned. Going heavier down the Surge Bryson routes for more turbo discards can be nice. The Clefairy Doll to help out against ADP, Giraffe Rig to help out against Mewtwo, and a few other things here and there. If you want to play the Mareep U-turn board combo instead of the Poké-Dolls, you can do. And if you want to have a better time against some spreading approaches, you can try adding in Skypillar and Champs Fest as like a one-of into the list as well. Those are all obviously things that we've considered in Birds previously, so not a big deal for these to sneak back into the list here and there if you think they're important enough. And then there's the doll stall list. It's really funny how I thought that Sawsbuck was going to be the deck that used Poké-Doll best, but it turns out there's a way more cancerous win condition for Clefairy Doll. It's just going to be decking the opponent out good and simple with Bella Bryson Man instead, and it's meant that the deck has warped into such a way that is just playing a very, very high Florges count, trying to use Elms to get your initial Flabébés down, and then using Steven's Resolve to get into your rare candies, and then you're going to loop the Clefairy Doll and Lusamine loop your supporters so that you can run the opponent out of deck, basically. So yeah, that's going to be the build. It's a very, very scary archetype for sure. Not many decks have great answers to this because it naturally has things like Skypillar, things like Stealthy Hood. Obviously, it plays a couple copies of Mew. It plays the one-off Goomy so that you don't just lose to Beheeyem. So yeah, it has answers to so much stuff that basically decks need to have very concrete answers. Basically, they need item lock to be able to beat you. And yeah, that's really scary. For other options in the list, you could try think about things like Mimikyu Shrine, although I don't think that's mandatory at all. It can shut down some annoying abilities. Reset Stamp, just to give your opponent a bit more of a hard time in those like mid games, so that they can't close on you. Maybe if you've not set up the perfect lock, sometimes a stamp can help out. Will can be nice, just that you can guarantee a coin flip on a Florgus, and if you're Lucimining back Will, it just gives you a bit of peace of mind that you know, like, you can always get at least one heads, and it's always at least one doll back for the following turn. Earringing Bell is actually a tool card that I've used with in the deck. Just for those situations where you are flipping multiple heads, you can Earringing Bell your Clefairy dolls, and it forces people to play cards, basically, because they're confused, and it either means that they're passing turns, or they're playing cards to help your win condition for Bryson Man at the end of the day, which could be pretty decent. At the same time, even if we're not attacking with a Sawsbuck, you could think about adding in one, like a 1/1 line to this list, just so that you have more immediate access to your Florgus trainers that you're putting back on top of the deck. So essentially it means that if you do flip those double heads once again, you can Sawsbuck into one of them and then make sure the next top deck is, again, a helpful card. Whereas sometimes with this deck, you're in a situation where you've flipped heads on your first Florgus and there's still 2 flips to go, and you don't want to flip them just because you only have like one doll in your discard pile, for example, and you don't want to start flipping more heads because then you're further away from the next Clefairy doll. So having a Sawsbuck sort of neatens that up a little bit, and it means that you can take full advantage of your gifts every single turn. So yeah, that's what I think about Florgus dolls. I do think it's an archetype that you have to be a little bit aware of, for sure. Outside the top 10, I think the biggest one to note is Blacephalon GX. I think it's a little bit harsh of me not having it in the top 10. And honestly, I'm surprised that it wasn't in there, but I'm not a huge believer in Blounds. It didn't actually do well, like that good in the Unified Minds meta. It was like probably just scraping by as a top 10 deck. And I don't think much changes for it. I think ADP is actually a pretty awkward matchup for you. And yeah, I think the archetype's basically in the same spot it was. It doesn't really gain anything. Island Challenge Amulet isn't that strong for the deck, it turns out. And it still has to worry about Malamar. It still has to worry about all this other stuff. So I'm not like super impressed by Blacephalon. I don't think it changes too much. Great Catcher helps you close games against tag teams, but you were already meant to be having good matchups against tag teams anyways. So in a vacuum, I don't think the deck changes like enough for it to be like way better in any means. Elsewhere, we've got Dark Box. New and improved Dark Box still falls just shy of my top 10. The community as well only ranked it at 11th. I do think it is a lot more consistent now and a lot faster. It is much better tempo. But Black Lance is not a good enough payoff, especially if people are playing Malolana, so that's a bit of a shame. I do think that Dark Moon GX is nuts in this format, and building towards that is definitely like a great win condition, and at the same time you have things like Guzzlord and you have things like Sabletar that can actually cause trouble for some of these control decks, for sure. But I do think that at the end of the day, your control matchups are worse than Quagnag's, so you should probably just play that. So yeah, Quagnag I think also suffers from Malolana syndrome, similar to Malamar, where you can't just be happy that you're just two-shotting stuff now with Hydro Pumps and whatnot and using Keldeo. Like, yes, Keldeo is a good card, but more people are adding in answers because they're conscious of the archetype thanks to ADP, so Quagnag feels like a worse ADP in my book. Potentially you put ADP into Quagnag and try and make that work, but that sounds super clunky in my eyes. Behemoth to try and help out against Pidgeotto control could be decent. You can also put in things like Mimikyu Shrine package into this list so you don't lose instantly to things like Mewtwo, but I do think that eats into bench space. Of course, you can use Clefairy Doll with Behemoth, but it's not quite as infinite as some of these other decks, and I do think it's one of the least consistent ways to play a Pidgeotto deck, so yeah, that's the reason why it's not quite made the top 10. Spiritomb can definitely benefit from Great Catcher. I really do think it's a much more aggressive archetype, and a Spiritomb Beast deck wouldn't surprise me if it ended up doing like reasonably well. I do still think it has the horrible Malamar matchup and a pretty bad time against Mewtwo. Obviously, you're going to try and play Mimikyu Shrine in the Spiritomb deck, but they're going to play Hoods as well, so I mean, there's always that's an issue. And with all this other stuff, you're a non-GX, you're trying to two-shot stuff, at least in those initial turns, because you've not been able to build enough Spite in the game, and they're just going to Malolana, undo that damage, knock out Spiritomb, and life gets rough for you. So I think that's the reason why I don't have Spiritomb much higher. Lucario Melmetal is actually like a decent card. Well, a decent deck, I would say. I think the biggest thing that annoys me is that you're having to play an energy split with Welder and Metal Energies, which is a little bit annoying, and Steel Fist is just terrible pressure. So the card can outgrind people, especially with Malolana in the format now, as something that you can Lusamine back, which is pretty ugly. Whereas previously it was just like a bunch of Great Pots and Mixed Herbs. So the win condition of Luke Metal gets much stronger, as slowly grinding out the opponent and making sure they actually can't close a game against you. But I do still think there's enough fire stuff in format which is a little bit awkward. And you're just less consistent than some of these other green-based decks, which is a bit of a problem. The Nuzzle Chew deck could be worth looking into, just because if you're up against decks that are going to try and take things slow, you can try and like double Pachirisu and get a board of like 200 plus damage into play and just spam powerful sparks against people, which is really nice. I do like the Nuzzly Gathering engine. It does really offer a great amount of consistency. And if you play Zeb Striker, you'll have a good time against Control as well. So I think there's a lot to be said about this deck as a non-GX. I think it's still being gatekept by Malamar. I think it's still got a bad time against Mewtwo. But it can do decently well against some other stuff. And then there's the Trev Noir handlock approach. It gets a lot of pieces from the new set. Tag Call, again, being a great card for this sort of deck. And yeah, I think there's some definitely more stuff to be sort of ironed out with this sort of build. I haven't seen a consistent enough one that makes me think, yeah, like this is really good. But it's definitely something that gives me a bit of, like, I'm kind of scared of facing this archetype the whole time, just because you know that they can just pop off with combo, and then you're suddenly not playing the game, and you're not going to be playing the game until they've won. So, yeah, that is a little bit of a fear factor against that archetype. It didn't really show up in Paris, which is the only opportunity it's had so far, outside of a couple people playing it within Malamar. So I'm sort of still giving it the benefit of the doubt that it could just be one of these archetypes that, if built correctly, can take down tournaments, because it is pretty disruptive at the end of the day. So that's it for today's video, guys. I hope you did enjoy. I am, of course, traveling tomorrow to Sao Paulo. I'm going to be commentating alongside Carl Sablehouse, Jose Crims Rojano, and Nicholas Pierce. So you can check out the stream at twitch.tv/PokemonTCG. If I was going to be a player at this event, I think a couple of picks I have here for you would be Blacephalon Birds, if you want to have some fun and possibly dodge and weave, and you will definitely be able to make it into day 2, as long as you don't run into a whole heap of Mewtwo and Mally. You should be pretty chill. And if you want to win the whole thing, U3 seems like the deck that has the answers to beat everything. Getting that blend right is going to be difficult. I think sometimes you may have to take an approach that we've seen from people like Danny and Azul to great regional performances, where you've just taken the sack to certain matchups. So maybe like you're not playing Hoods, or maybe you're not playing Labs or a Greninja here or there, just so that you're more consistent as a Mewtwo inherently. But at the same time, if you want to have all the answers, Mewtwo has that possibility available to it. So let me know what you guys think about the top 10 list. Where do you place all these archetypes? Do you think ReshiRom is still complete trash? I'll hear it all down below. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I will see you in another video tomorrow. Cheers.